beautiful on the surface but rotten underneath. Don't ever, even for a second, doubt that this is the most dangerous world in the galaxy. Danger does not always come in the shape of orcs with bolters, Ragnar. This world is where the elite of the Imperium have gathered. We are talking now of the most ruthless, ambitious, unscrupulous collection of rogues ever culled from 1,000,000 planets. This is the place they have come to realize their ambitions, and on Terra, they can and will not let anything stand in their way. Not me, not you, not their own kin, if need be. William King Wolfblade. The Imperium of Man, a stellar empire spanning the entire galaxy. Millions of planets are united under the rule of the Emperor of Mankind, who has sat upon the Golden Throne for tens of thousands of years and wages war against the unimaginable horrors of the universe in his name. And though life for a human in the Imperium is far from the ideal of a bright future, it is under its dominion that humans, after millennia of discord, have become the dominant species in the galaxy. However, despite all its uniqueness, the Imperium adheres to the same laws of logistics and economics as the thousands of states that existed before it. Planets constantly require resources from outside sources and protection from unfortunate threats, which can spawn across the universe. Among all the variety of worlds, there exists a planet that is a true jewel of the Imperium, a planet whose name is known even in the farthest corners of the galaxy, Holy Terra. Holy Terra, marvel of the galaxy, heart of wonder, no jewel shone more brightly, no canker was more foul. At its nexus met the fears and glories of a species, rammed tight within the spires and the vaults, the pits and the habwarrens. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. The Imperium, like its predecessors, is a typical example of a colonial power. And though its scales are immense, if in the 19th century the sun never set on the British Empire, then in the 41st millennium the Imperium not only owns this very sun, but also millions of other stars. Nevertheless, some processes occur according to the same principles as tens of millennia ago. For example, the Imperium holds an absolute monopoly on the exploitation of natural and human resources on planets under its rule. This is not surprising in the complete absence of competing powers. Savages like orcs, arrogant but dying Eldar, or insignificant Tau are not considered competitors. They continue to pollute the galaxy with their presence only due to a regrettable misunderstanding. There is also no talk of civilizational, cultural and linguistic expansions. Over 10,000 years, despite all the diversity of worlds and their inhabitants, common features have emerged for the entire Imperium, such as the main language, common currency, and the only mandatory religion for all citizens. Like its predecessors, the Imperium has its metropolis, Terra, the cradle of humanity. From there began humanity's path to eternal and absolute dominion over space. It was from there that the first colonist ships set off into the Dark Ages, and it was there that the Emperor began his crusade. Terra is the most sacred and revered place among all the millions of worlds that make up the Imperium. However, over the millennia, the planet's appearance has changed beyond recognition, and few of us, looking at Holy Terra from orbit, would immediately recognize it as our native land. In the 41st millennium, the planet long ceased to be a green-blue sphere, reflecting the sun's rays in a breathable atmosphere. The capital of the Imperium has long become a hive world covering the entire surface with one enormous city. But you still have to try to discern it amidst the endless stream of spacecraft and the network of countless orbital stations. The planet has long lost its original appearance. The boundless expanses of oceans disappeared thousands of years ago during the wars of the Age of Strife. Most of the mountain ranges have long been leveled to the ground, and all the natural flora and fauna of the planet have succumbed to the relentless pressure of human civilization. Even the air, saturated with the smell of sweat and exhaust fumes, is suitable for breathing only thanks to the work of ancient purification facilities. The entire planet is shrouded in the impenetrable smoke of perpetual smog, through which the spires of multi-kilometer structures break through. There is no sunlight on the planet's surface for a long time. And on this planet suffering from monstrous overpopulation, the palace of the Emperor sprawls, occupying almost the entire territory of Central Asia. It is the site of the fiercest battles of the heresy era, and the destination of billions of pilgrims who flock here from all over the empire, dying in the warp travels of the orbital stations and the suffocating crowds, hoping at least to see with their own eyes the walls of the majestic structure at whose heart their emperor resides. Despite its status as a metropolis, where resources from all corners of the Imperium converge, and where the literal centre of power is located, life on Terra for the average person differs little from life in any other hive. The same grueling long work shifts, the same priests, the same arbitrators, and even the Imperial Guard. The same meagre ration of food and the same living conditions, with the only difference being that they are imbued with the awareness that you are living in the very centre of the Imperium, on the most heavily guarded planet in the galaxy. However, even the fact that you will never experience an Orc invasion or a raid by the Dark Eldar is unlikely to be a consolation for those forced to live in the lower levels of the hive. There were few illusions down here, where life was measured in a few half-decades and the sun was never seen. Still, the rabble army ran on with enough enthusiasm, knowing what inaction would cost them. Spinoza had told Lermontov nothing of Crowl's suspicions over the purpose of the Xenos incursion. It would make no difference to their desire for vengeance, something she could approve of even if everything else was anathema. They ran, and the air became cold and clammy. Spinoza had not been cold since arriving on this roasting, parched planet, and it felt strangely alien to her. The stench became overwhelming. If the sewer tunnels had once fed into active processing stations, the systems had long since broken down. The sloped walls and roof were caked in a glowing mat of organic pulp, and straggly creatures scampered through the shallows ahead of them, draggled and sleek. All told, Spinoza had around her the only living things still capable of thriving on this old, spoiled world: humans, rats, and algae. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. Like any other hive in the Imperium, Terra has its lower levels where sunlight does not reach. They serve as a refuge for the most destitute inhabitants, who often find themselves living alongside mutants and engaging in a constant struggle for survival. The lower levels of the hive are a lawless place, ruled unchecked by gangs who are in constant warfare with each other. Arbitrators do not penetrate these spaces. Neither priests nor tech priests venture there. People are entirely left to fend for themselves. In such conditions, it is difficult to maintain the appearance of a proud representative of one's species, let alone one who rules the galaxy. Pale, sunless skin, decaying teeth, tumours — this is the appearance of the inhabitants of the lower levels. And the most terrible thing is that nobody cares about their suffering. People in the lower levels die by the thousands, and no one takes. It is hard, to live, to carry on living. And then someone comes and tells you that there's another way. There'll be rations, better than we have now. More HAB units, given to those that need them, and they'll stop the killings down in the Underhive. They'll send arbitrators down there, and they'll stop the ones that hunt us. You know that we're hunted? Of course you do. They find the bodies all the time, and no one does anything. They never have. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. Despite being an accurate description of the lower levels of any hive on Terra, the circumstances are further exacerbated by overcrowding. Even where life seems impossible on Terra, you will still encounter crowds of people, especially during festivals when pilgrims from across the Imperium literally fill every space of the vast city. Spinoza leant against the balcony's railings. Even in the hour before sunrise, it was still humid. Her throat was dry, and swallowing only brought more filth into her system. Overhead, the permanent cloud cover was angry with reflected flame, a shifting mass of bloody turmoil broken only by the ink-black profile of the world city's extremities. Far below her, the causeways were now entirely occupied with teeming crowds of pilgrims, roaring out their devotion in increasingly frenzied tones. They knew that time was running out. If they were still languishing in Salvatore by now, then they had little chance of fighting their way anywhere close to the palace approaches in time. Most of them did not know the way in any case. If given no guidance, they would soon wander into oblivion, dropping off the face of the world and into one of its many pits of forgetfulness. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. Certainly, even in our time, life in an impoverished area is not the most pleasant thing. However, Terra is not entirely composed of such areas. Those fortunate enough to secure a job within one of the Adeptus Terra structures can boast of much more comfortable conditions several hundred floors above. For all that vast crowds of people forever made their way across the causeways and transit lanes, the majority on Terra never once left the enclosure of their own giant spires over the course of an entire lifetime. They would be born in the industrial natal units, ripped from their mothers at the earliest opportunity to be sprayed with disinfectant and branded with time and location stamps. They would be educated in the Spire's indoctrination units in classes 500 strong, where priests and scholars bearing electroprods would bellow out the lists of the fallen for memorization and impress the sacred trinity of fears, the alien, the heretic, the mutant. At the age of 10 standard, most would be assigned work details, taking into account any particular aptitude, a position in low-level manufactoria, food tank processors, engineering squadrons, or refuse collection. The more gifted would be given assignments in the Spire's myriad security and control organizations, or service the Tower's colossal internal life support systems. The most gifted of all would end up in Huron Valco's position, tiny cogs in the Adeptus Terra's unimaginably vast web of administrators. Many more again would fall between the cracks entirely, living a precarious life in the grimy shadows, feeding on the unwary, hunted by the overburdened arbitrators, an existence little better than that of the beasts which had once shared Terra's poisoned biosphere. No matter their station, when death claimed them, their bodies would be taken down into the furnaces, the organs extracted, and the hair stuffed into sacking, and the rest fed to greedy flames that never went out. Their eyes, now floating in preservation vials and dispatched via servitor to recycler apothecarians, would never have seen a sunrise unfiltered by dirty plexiglass. Their skin would never have felt the brush of the world's wind. Their ears would never have been free of the endless hum of the Spire's engines and its forges. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. Although the inhabitants of Terra, who can be considered middle class, are infinitely far from the residents of the lower levels, they still have to cope with the same problems caused by overcrowding as their less fortunate counterparts. The hive itself is far from the most comfortable place in the universe. Those who are forced to live in the very center of the toxic smog cloud more than confirm this rule. Of course, it would be foolish to deny the obvious advantage of civilization. The residents of the middle hives are under constant protection of the arbiters, and they are not bothered by mutants. The food ration is significantly different from that in the lower levels in its consistency, but along with it come far from pleasant aspects of imperial citizen life. Journeymaster Adjuster Holbeck padded down the winding passage towards his personal chambers, feeling the effects of a 20-hour shift prey on his aging constitution. His belly flapped across an overtight belt, his soft-soled shoes slipping atop polished stone flags. Pseudo-flames guttered low in framed candelabras, an antique touch of nonsense that the Chartist guilds were fond of preserving in their private sanctums. Through narrow mullioned windows he could make out the night glitter of the eternal city running west, luminous under low-hanging cloud banks. There was no moon. There was never a moon, not unless the rad blooms higher up broke apart for a moment, gifting the terrestrials a fleeting look at the skies that had once been the species' inspiration to break out into the void. He reached his chamber and absently tapped the 9-digit cipher into the door slot. A micro-needle punched a minuscule incision into a pudgy finger. The analytical cycler's whirred and the lock lumen winked green. He pushed against the brushed steel surface wearily, and it slid to reveal a cramped and semi-lit interior. Holbeck lurched inside, throwing the day's tally scrolls onto a low sideboard. Dirty windows on the far wall offered a privileged vista of the nightscape outside. A landscape of jagged spikes, studded with lurid points of light from hab lumens, search beams, furnace plumes, and the glowing swarms of air traffic, all set against the stained churn of the ever-moving thunderheads. The air was hot, humid, like the breakpoint before a storm, except that those clouds never broke. They just boiled and shifted, hemming in the heat, wreathing the world below in a gasping clutch of desiccation. He was sweating, and he poured himself a long drink refiltered water, laced with pure alcohol, flavoured with synthetic cardamom. Then he went over to a long couch, the leather real but patched, the steel frame speckled with rust. As he sank down onto it, the joints squealed and the coils sagged. He looked over his apartment, high up on the spire's western flank. It was a privileged position by most standards, but not as high as he'd have liked. Not up into the opulent levels where the air was scraped through filters to excise the grit and the floors were cooled, and there were living plants, watered from cisterns that the parched multitudes below could have survived off for a year. Chris Ray, the carrion throne. Long working shifts, a modest yet stable diet, and numerous chronic illnesses caused by the planet's toxic atmosphere are constant companions for those living in the middle levels of the Terra hive. This is how the majority lives. By Terra's standards, such living conditions are considered quite acceptable. In a world where familiar streets have long been replaced by endless narrow corridors and elevators, and people are forced to squeeze into cramped residential modules measuring just a few square meters, few can afford any luxuries. Only if that person is one of the most important and respected servants of the Emperor. Both wolves pulled themselves out. Ragnar studied his surroundings carefully. They were in a massive atrium. Far overhead, an armor-glass ceiling allowed natural light to play down into the hall. From where he stood, he could see countless balconies rising up the inside of the building. In each wall was a massive, translucent elevator shaft. Although Ragnar knew this place could not be nearly so massive as the Fang, it felt as if it was, and it was disorientating to a newcomer. While the Fang felt like a base of battle brothers, this felt more like a bazaar. Humans from all over the civilized galaxy thronged the place. He could see catechans in green silk and pale Boreans in robes of whale fur. There were metal-armored men from the forge worlds of the Talian Rim. One incredibly obese man reclined on a suspensor palanquin while two beautiful naked girls fanned his shaved head, and sweating servants pulled him through the crush. Retainers in the elaborate uniform of Belisarius passed everywhere on their errands. Many possessed bionic eyes and prosthetic limbs. Some were armed. The building was the product of a great artistic endeavour. The walls were carved with frescoes. Gargoyles clutched glow globes in their talons. Saints radiated light from their halos as they perched on platforms above the throng. Closer inspection told Ragnar that some of the statues had televisor eyes. He could see that a great deal of business was being conducted here. Niches in the walls led into halls from which came the sound of haggling and bargains being struck. Goods were traded for other wares. Future contacts were being exchanged. Agreements about the use of ships and fleets and navigators were being made. William King Wolfblade. High-ranking officials of the Administratum, respected officers of the Imperial Guard, members of navigator families and leaders of Adeptus Terra divisions, all of them can afford to live in the cleanest and most luxurious districts of Terra. Typically, these districts are the upper levels of the hive. However, even the highest floor from which you can see the walls of the Emperor's palace will be valued much more than a similar floor on the other side of the planet. Nonetheless, in most cases, the wealthy and influential people of Terra have made considerable efforts to distance themselves as far as possible from those less fortunate. However, as is often the case in the real world, such material prosperity inevitably comes with a plethora of problems and dangers associated with its possessor. Constant intrigues, assassination attempts, and the risk of attracting the attention of the Inquisition. This is the harsh reality of any high-ranking citizen of the Imperium. In this regard, Terra differs from other worlds only in scale. Because even if you are fortunate enough to find yourself among those who have found a place within the walls of the Emperor's palace, you will be horrified to discover that all these underhanded games have now taken on truly galactic proportions. However, the Custodes and the Inquisition know their business well, and the situation within the palace walls never escalates beyond what is permitted. Essentially, Terra is a concentrated embodiment of all aspects of the imperial way of life, magnifying all the problems of large cities to the absolute. However, even on this planet, disruptions occur in life. And although little can surpass the battles of the Horus Heresy or the downfall of Gurgivandira, every year the inhabitants and leaders experience a special event. A few insane days that paralyze the entire planet's work, finally stopping the already dense flow of transportation and overloading all communication channels. The Sanguinala comes to Terra. On that day, once every solar year, the numbers swelled beyond reason, and the pilgrims crammed like cattle into the feeder stations, clawing at the gates and screaming at the guards to let them in. The most exalted of all, so they said, would be permitted to approach the Eternity Gate itself, to witness the rites of remembrance performed on the site of the angel's legendary stand as the feast reached its frenetic climax. Now, Sanguinala was just a week away, and the canyons of Terra's world city were already bursting. Every looping thoroughfare and crumbling causeway was swollen with a living carpet of supplicants, chanting the rituals, swaying in unison, moving with the inexorable purpose of an invading army towards the cavernous moors of the outer palace itself. Over them all hung the attack craft of the Adeptus Arbites, the black-clad judges more watchful than ever for the bad seeds hidden among the multitudes. Every passing hour saw them swooping into the throngs, dragging out a ranting disciple or witch in potentia and bundling them into the crew bays of their hovering scrutiny lifters. The air was hot. Frenzy gripped the megapolis, and supplicants went mad amid the dust. Looming above the lesser towers, massive beyond imagination, the titanic walls of the outer palace soared in tarnished splendor, waiting for the inundation to crash against their flanks. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. The annual celebration, during which people gather to honor the sacrifice of one of the Emperor's sons, the Primarch Sanguinius, inevitably turns into a real catastrophe for Terra. Billions of pilgrims arriving on Terra from all corners of the Imperium literally fill up all the already limited free space, and only a few of them will succeed in reaching their goal. And although this celebration is one of the main events and is celebrated throughout the galaxy, for the native inhabitants, it only means even more work. After all, this entire crowd needs to be controlled, requiring almost as many people as there are pilgrims themselves. But even so, by the end of the celebration, the situation always becomes critical. The pilgrim columns below them had swelled into a living ocean of red-robed humanity, surging up from the moor gates and out onto the greater avenues immaculate, teeming in their millions, filling every scrap of empty rockcrete, and marching forth in dirty, swaying ranks. There were far too many to count, far too many to halt, a host of the devoted dredged from every backwater world in the Imperium of man, and hurled into its heart of tarnished gold. They were dying in their droves, even now, suffocated by the press of bodies, parched and withered from months without adequate food or water, bloated with contagion from the passage in stinking void hulls. But still they tramped onwards, crying out for salvation, swinging the regulation blood lanterns they had paid their last coin to obtain, gasping out hymns to the sacrificed before their strength gave out and they were trodden underfoot by the thousands coming on behind. The arbitrators could only watch that progress now, hovering high in their Raptor crowd suppression gunships, powerless against the current of blind fanaticism that surged onwards and inwards. Millions of troops from the Astra Militarum regiments had been mobilized to line the high places, all standing in ranks 5 deep. But they could all have emptied their lasgun power packs 10 times over and made little more than a dent in those numbers. Chris Ray, the Carrion Throne. What can be said when in the final days of the celebration even the Inquisition cannot effectively use its communication channels, and even the custodians, the Emperor's personal guards, cannot overlook this event? Terra undoubtedly is the center of Imperial power, a planet where streams of ships from across the galaxy converge and where countless people strive to reach. However, like everything in the Imperium, by the second millennium of the 42nd century, Terra is a quintessential example of the Warhammer 40k universe, characterized by absolutism and hyperbole. The planet produces absolutely nothing, as all its resources have long been depleted, and no new buildings have been erected on it for 1,000 years, simply because there is no space for them. People here are just cogs in a vast machine, like on any other planet. Terra has long ceased to be the cosy home for the human race as we know it today. In the 42nd millennium, the planet much more resembles a tomb encased in steel and shrouded in the perpetual smog, where the ancient legacy of human intellect is sealed away, long forgotten by anyone. After all, people here simply don't have time to remember it. They are too busy in their continuous service to their ruler. This is Terra, where when you receive a gift, you must always be ready to give something in return. That's the end of my story. I'm a bit old for all these complicated names from the Warhammer 40k universe, so if I've got the pronunciation wrong somewhere, please let me know in the comments. I'll keep it in mind for my next videos.